Hello and welcome to this week's reflection. I'm going to start by talking about my project and its weirdness, and like weirdness in terms of relevance to how things are unfolding about the election now. And also, I want to talk a little about a dude who was very, very wrong, but at least delightful to read in his assertion of being wrong about the canon being the greatest because they're just the greatest, and that's why. But first, I want to talk about my personal project, the big project at the end of the quarter, because I've been reading The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, and it feels like it weirdly connects in that it's become what I read becoming my reality. Not that like Hannah Arendt brought forth Joe Biden beating Trump. I mean, if she did, awesome. But everything that has been happening since, if you read The Origins of Totalitarianism, um, the chaos and just crappy management that like Trump seems to be doing with removing certain people within their positions in the Department of Justice and just wherever they are within the military and inserting unqualified people into those positions. And we've seen it throughout his administration, Davos, others. Just this isn't a political thing, but how that seems stupid and like back patty and like not nepotism, but like classicism. Let's call it that because he just puts rich people. But from what looks like just putting rich people in positions of power to help is actually within a totalitarian regime a very decided act that you put people within power in positions they are highly unqualified for because they then owe their position of power and everything they are to you, which doesn't really work so well for Trump with millionaires, but it does work well with people within the government who are just trying to eke out a career. But I found that super interesting. There's tons of other things. I mean, this book has kind of turned me into a tinfoil hat crazy with most people because when politics comes up, because that's all that ever comes up, I can always be like, oh, that's a fun little like tidbit that kind of connects to totalitarianism. People are like, really? And then I pull out the book or I pull out the audio book and I play a section and I'm like, yeah, just listen. And they're like, oh, wow. And they see stuff that Arendt talks about and that the Nazis and the communists and Soviets did perfectly, and Trump is trying to emulate. But this all is super interesting, but it connects to my larger project because I'm talking about how the things that we interact with in the world affect our perceptions of reality, and I'm building off of Heidegger and Althusser. And then I'm using sociological studies and ethnographic studies of police officers to look at their perceptions of themselves based on the public, what the public also thinks about them, and then the idea that most of what the public thinks about them is based off of this genre of the cop genre, where they really do no wrong but overstep the bounds of legal what they can legally do. They're the good guys. They're highly efficient. They never catch the wrong guy, and how that sort of thing has affected both how cops view themselves and how people view cops. Not to say that this causes that to sort of happen. You know, I'm not taking that rap music causes violence or video games causes violence stance because, as we know, violence has been around a lot longer than the cops have and all of this stuff has. But I think that how police officers and the public view them does play on that, and the perceptions in the media definitely, I feel like, play on that. And I bring that up here because I don't know if I would have naturally made these connections to totalitarianism if I wasn't reading this book. And this book, although it's just a factual account of like how totalitarianism came to be, or an argument of how it came to be and how it functions, I can see it in the real world, and that to me is just super interesting that my perception of reality has been directly influenced on a book on totalitarianism that I've been reading, and that's like just a sliver of what I'm exposed to, and it's literally just a book on totalitarianism. Whereas in the rest of the world, we are bombarded by imagery and media 24/7 informing our worldviews, and that is kind of scary and exciting at the same time because we're the most highly literate we've ever been, and judging by what's going on around us, we are the least competent in being literate and being not literate, but being critical readers. And I hate using being a good reader, that word, but it feels like we are like wholly unprepared as readers for the amount of literacy that we are engaged in on a daily basis. But that may be something I can try to incorporate into my paper, but it feels like that's just adding on at the end. Now to just so subtly transition to our readings. I cannot for the life of me remember the guy's name, but I will find out. I wanted to talk about that one specifically because I found it interesting. It was Bloom, Elegy for the Canon. I feel like Bloom, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this politely. Bloom's wrong. I think that the authors within the canon are great authors, and there's no disputing that. I mean, you could if you tried to rank them, but I feel like everybody would agree Shakespeare is a great playwright and deserves to be remembered and canonized and studied in some way, shape, or form. But whether or not we have to consider 28 of his plays all worth like must read, must have, must watch, because as somebody who went to Eastern who had a regular Shakespeare class required as part of their degree, had Shakespeare and a Brit Lit 1 as part of their degree, and then also could have taken a seminar in Shakespeare at that university with its tiny-ass English department. Just kind of lets you know that while he's great, he's a little bit overrepresented in the canon. I mean, that's not to say that Shakespeare isn't amazing, because he is, and I'm picking on Shakespeare because Bloom, like, seems to focus primarily, like, uses Shakespeare a lot. Like, Shakespeare is in the canon because he's Shakespeare and he's amazing. Yeah, he's in the canon because he's Shakespeare and amazing, but there are plenty of other writers who did similar plays to his where we could probably just as easily swap one of his out and not lose as much, because not all of his plays are the greatest. Like, I think I'm not even going to try to rank them, but like Romeo and Juliet, King Lear, Midsummer Night's Dream, Macbeth, those are all really great. And Merchant of Venice, but to say that every single one of his plays should be looked at in length and he should be idolized the way he is in the canon is a little bit ridiculous, because as Bloom points out, just the sheer size of the canon, and as he was writing this, was thousands and thousands of books, and it's expanding there, that it's really impossible to read it all. So why does somebody who... That was what struck me as so interesting, is if it's impossible to read it all, why is somebody being so heavily canonized if it's already impossible to read? Like, trim it down, pick out like the best works, the things that critically can be agreed on is really, really great. I would say, given the historical context of Taming of the Shrew, given that it was like, depending on the reading you want to take on it, there's readings that it was a feminist critique of marriage, and that Shakespeare was advocating for no more physical abuse and only mental abuse, which is kind of fucked up. But given that there's a play, and I can't remember the damn name of it, but the whole idea is that a dude, when his wife is mouthing off to him the same way she would, and that sounds like such a horrible thing to say, as Kate is in Taming of the Shrew, right? I can't remember. I feel like I'm going to mix 10 things I hate about you with the play. But anyways, it's a response to a play that there's an idea that a woman is being, I don't want to say, like, she's just being defiant of her husband's will. There you go. That's the easiest way to say it. And he doesn't like it, and his response is to cut her or beat her up and braise the shit out of her and then wrap her in a horsehide covered in salt. I can't remember the name of it, but that's literally a play, and it was popular back then. Like, before Shakespeare started writing, like it was a culturally relevant thing, like within 40 years of Shakespeare being alive, I think. But to talk about that would be great, or the Merchant of Venice, and like bringing back the origins and like the feelings about like the Jewish people and using that to highlight the, because that's been something that has been on Europe's mind for thousands of years for some reason. But anyways, stop rambling. There are certain ones of Shakespeare that are worth doing, but like he's just overblown in the canon. And as Bloom points out, the canon is so huge. Why? That we can't even read it anyways. So why try to tear it down? That's kind of his argument, is we can't read it anyway, so why try to tear it down? And we kind of got in conversations about undercutting the canon by, does it actually do anything to destroy them, or should we just try to add to them? I don't know. I think more reclamation needs to be done in terms of salvaging and finding other authors who haven't really been heard from, because there are great stories by authors who just are not canonical. Like, I like to point to Lepard. I've read 2 of the stories that I can find of his, and they're both fantastic, but he's not a highly touted author. Yeah, and I always find that interesting, that we are always finding authors that are better than some, or just as talented, but they were left out because they were women, people of color, this, just a myriad of reasons, and most of it all revolves around not being white and male. But I think that instead of destroying the canon, we need to historicize the canon. I think we talked about this and be like, there are historical factors that play into this, you know. Like, in the beginning of Bloom's article, he talks about some of the canonical great authors and how they get referenced by each other and are in communication with each other, and some of us like to overlook the fact that they were actually communicating with each other as well. So like that sort of, my friend is just as talented as I am, or just as great because I'm a great poet and I think they're a great poet, so you should read their great poetry. Like, they don't really touch on that, and even when we discussed, we didn't touch on that. Like, that interplay is also conversational with discussing with each other, but also being friends with each other. I mean, I can't remember who all was there, but if you look at when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein on that whole crazy weekend, like, there are some other heavy hitting writers there, and like they're friends with them, and then it's like we wonder why. It's like, it's no coincidence that like people who were friends with each other and were writers, they became famous together. It's like because they were friends and they were encouraging people to read their friends' shit. You know, not to say that the writers weren't worthwhile, because it feels like a lot of them were friends with other writers who fell out, but there is an amount of who you know going on here that like Bloom and others don't want to recognize with the canon, and I think that we should, and I think going forward we need to do as much reclamation and reclaiming and finding lost voices in the past and bringing them forward and being like, these guys are worthy to be alongside those guys, because as we've seen with like Thérèse Raquin and other books that we've talked about and other classes, they started out as dime store novels, trashy pieces, borderline pornographic, and then eventually, because either the author wrote other novels that were taken more seriously, or they just somehow persisted or had a following with them, you know, like how Melville, who died like poor and unknown, and then had this weird resurgence and following to where he's now an American classic. But that sort of stuff needs to be looked at and taken into account, because there are a lot of probably great writers who were writing in genres that were considered less than literature. And I like that that's something that we make a distinction between, but we don't really hit on, because at least not in this part, but like the push for literature as a thing to be taken seriously, I think it's another article I cannot for the life of me remember, kind of coincided with when commercial publishing and whatnot became available, that then there was this push for literature to be taken seriously as a field of study and looking at it, and that it kind of coincided with literature becoming a commercially viable enterprise, and that literary studies became a commercially viable field of study, sort of a thing. They talk about that in an article I cannot remember, and I'm over butchering it, but I found that these sort of things that I'm bringing up that Bloom just outright fails to either acknowledge or look at, I find funny. And I mean, I give it to him for sticking by his guns and being like, the canon is the canon because it's the greatest thing ever. But I think the canon is the canon because people who thought it was the greatest thing ever insisted on its greatness. And there are some things that are truly great, but a lot of people, it's become great because they were told it was great and we insisted is great. And I mean, just think about your favorite book. I can't help but come back to Nicolette in Moby Dick because she hated that book. And most people loved it or liked it. And I think that that's an interesting, and I know it sounds rambly, but it is. That's interesting because that's what winds up happening a lot of times with great books is like the people who thought it was great end up being more than the people who didn't, or the people who thought it were great just wind up being loud enough to get the people who didn't to shut up and be like, fine, your book's great. I don't have to read it anymore, so fine. But anyways, I'm going to stop there. I just feel like I'm rambling on and going deeper and deeper into this. And yeah, have a good weekend.